Sufficient grace, and I will stand on every promise of your word. Great words, aren't they? Lovely words. And I'm sure that as many of us here have been nurtured in the traditions of the United Reformed Church or the Methodist Church, and those words will resonate with us nicely. We will stand on every promise of your word. Of course we will. They're comforting, reassuring, and uncontroversial words. Words suitable to reflect on in a church anniversary. And those words of the prophet Isaiah to the people of Israel as well, talking about how the lame would walk and the deaf would hear, and how there would be a new exodus, a new bringing to a promised land. Again, reassuring words. The God who'd brought their ancestors out of slavery would look after them as well. All things were well. Just what we need to hear. An anniversary celebration for this particular church, and people gathered here from other churches as well. I know there are friends from North Aram here among us as well, and we're celebrating together our Christian faith. And we should hear that comfort and reassurance, and we should be comforted and reassured by it. But, and I suspect you knew there might be a but coming after that, but what about some of the words and the actions that we heard recorded in Mark's Gospel, words and actions of Jesus? It's the reading set for today, and I thought, shall I use that on the church anniversary? And then I thought, yes, I will. We've just sung that beautiful worship song, I will stand on every promise of your word. A colleague of mine and a friend of mine, Gareth Hill, now lives in South Wales, writes a blog every week, and he looks ahead to the lectionary. In his blog this week, he wrote these words: a Jesus who calls a woman a dog, or who spreads his spit on another man's tongue, doesn't make for a cosy worship song or a trouble-free youth Bible study, or any sort of Bible study, actually. A Jesus who calls a woman a dog, at least that's the implication, he calls the people dogs, and who spit, that's what it says, he actually spat on the man's tongue. What do we make of that? We prefer, on the whole, when we look at these stories, to gloss over details like that and to go straight to the happy ending, the miracle cures. And they're important, of course they are. But on this 21st anniversary, as you come of age here in Christchurch, I want to invite you to spend some time with me now being a bit disturbed and asking questions about these uncomfortable words and actions of Jesus. What, if anything, can we get from them, or should we really just gloss over them and say, well, it's how it was then, we don't need to worry about it now? At the beginning of the Gospel reading, we heard that Jesus had gone away to Tyre. He'd gone away to outside the area where he was usually to be found teaching and performing miracles and being with people. And we know that he'd gone there because he wanted some peace and quiet. That's why he was there. He wanted to get away from the crowds that followed him wherever he went, just for a bit. He didn't want people to know that he was there. And perhaps he hoped that in that area where the majority of people were not Jews, he wouldn't be so well known. But word got out. And then a woman came to Jesus, and she begged him to heal her daughter. And Jesus' immediate response, probably not what we'd expect, because he refuses, and in refusing, he uses some very difficult words. And the words are there because this woman isn't Jewish. So he says, let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Ouch. That's harsh. That is really harsh. There have been many attempts to try and understand those words, and frankly, they are insulting words. Some have suggested that the Greek actually means a little dog, a pet dog, a puppy dog. And so that's okay then, isn't it? You're not a dog, you're just a puppy dog, you're just a little dog. No, it doesn't work. It's just as insulting, doesn't really help at all. Some have suggested that Jesus is actually making a point here about including everyone by encouraging the woman to make an argument for her own inclusion. So you insult her first, and if she responds well and makes a good argument, that makes a nice point for you. That's not the sort of thing that Jesus normally did. It's a bit cruel, really, isn't it? I wonder whether another idea might just help us more. At the end of the preceding chapter in Mark's Gospel, after Jesus had fed the 5,000, and then you may remember he'd crossed the Sea of Galilee in an attempt to get away from the crowds, we read these words. When they got out of the boat, that's Jesus and the disciples, the people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Can you imagine the scenes? Can you imagine there had been a frenzy of people coming to Jesus, and what were they coming for? They were coming to be healed. And it's very natural. Of course they came to be healed. But they're not coming for him for his teaching, for everything he has to offer. They're coming for the healing, looking for miracles. And then when he finally gets away again from all of that, this woman comes. And perhaps Jesus thinks, she's only coming to me for the healing, for what I can give. She knows nothing else about me, just a popular healer. The Jews at least knew about the promise of a Messiah, and although they didn't yet understand everything he was saying, they had an existing relationship with God that he could build on and with the Hebrew scriptures. So it made sense to go to the Jews first, to broaden their understanding, and then the good news might spread to others through them. So the going to others would come later, when you get the ones that got a bit of understanding first to understand it, and then they share it. But this woman perseveres. And through his conversation with her, Jesus is persuaded to include the Gentiles, the non-Jews, now. The woman has more understanding than he expected. She wants to find out more about him, as well as seeking a miracle cure. And he heals her daughter. If we understand the conversation between Jesus and the woman in this way, it doesn't get rid of all the problems, but it does challenge us. I think we might sometimes well consider ourselves to be the ones who, like the Jews, have an existing relationship with God and with Christ, and an existing depth of knowledge. And I hope and expect that that's true of many of us. We already know that relationship with God through Jesus. But perhaps we need to ask ourselves fairly regularly, why are we Christians? Why do we come to church Sunday after Sunday for 21 years or more or less? Why do we meet together and work together? And perhaps just challenge ourselves sometimes to say, what's more important to us? Is it the benefits of the companionship and the activities and the ways in which we can serve others over the essential growth in the personal knowledge of Jesus? Do we remember the basis, the core for everything we are and do? Do we pray and do we read the Bible regularly? Do we take time to be quiet in the presence of God? Do we listen to God? I'm going to leave you with 3 questions this morning. Not with 3 answers, by the way, just with 3 questions. And the first question is this one. As you come of age, are you a community of people who listen to God? Usually, in the gospel narrative, when Jesus goes away by himself, he goes away to pray. He wants to think about his calling. He wants to think about the work he's called to do, and he wants to be with God. And I think it's very likely that that's what he wanted to do in Tyre, and that's what the woman had interrupted. And I think he might have been a little bit irritated. I don't know about you, but I've had times when I've just gone away for a bit of peace and quiet somewhere, and something's come up, and I think, oh, really? Or I've planned to do this today, and then somebody comes along with something else, and I think, oh, really? Have I got to be distracted onto that now? I think he might have been a bit irritated. And yet, through this woman, Jesus actually reached a fuller understanding of his ministry and of what God was calling him to do. She helped him, actually, to understand what he was about, to get even closer to God. I know that may sound strange, this is Jesus we're talking about here, but Jesus was human, and he was a man and a person of his time, and she helped him. And then, in that second miracle that we read about today, Jesus cured a man who was deaf and who had a speech impediment. And after he was cured, he spoke, and others who were there spoke, and they couldn't be stopped from speaking about what had happened. Here was a man who could not be understood. And perhaps people hadn't really taken the time or had the patience to try to understand him. And now he could speak, and he had a lot to say. I enjoy watching the television series Who Do You Think You Are? I don't know if any of you watch it, when certain celebrities are helped to explore their ancestry, to find out where they've come from. It can be quite fascinating. Just this last week, it was Rose Ayling-Ellis who was featured. Rose Ayling-Ellis, if you don't know her, Rose is deaf. She won Strictly Come Dancing a couple of years ago, the first deaf contestant on that programme. And she's an actress and a television presenter. And she speaks really well, but because of her deafness, sometimes she is difficult to understand. And so there were subtitles on the screen last week, and I'm so glad there were, because what she had to say was absolutely fascinating. She's also been working with Claire Baldwin as a presenter of the Paralympics. And yesterday morning on the radio, I heard Claire Baldwin talking about that and saying how much she had learned from having Rose on the team with her. There may be those among us who we find it difficult to hear or to listen to. Who are they? How can we enable them to be heard? And how can we really listen to them? Because as we mature in our own life and faith, we need to be ready to listen to and to be challenged by others, sometimes the most surprising others. Yesterday, you think I did nothing but listen to the radio yesterday, but yesterday morning, I was driving a lot, that's why, I heard an interview with Professor Lucy Easthope. Now, I don't expect you may have heard of her, but I certainly hadn't. She's a leading authority on disaster recovery, and she was talking about the lessons that should be learned from the report on the Grenfell Tower. You remember that tower in London that burned down with such devastating loss of life? And she said, we need to learn to listen to the Cassandras. To listen to the Cassandras. Now, in Greek mythology, Cassandra was a Trojan princess, a very beautiful one. And she received the gift of prophecy. But she was cursed because she angered the god Apollo. It was in the usual way that women angered gods in Greek mythology. I'll tell you more about it later if you want to know. The curse of Cassandra was that she would continue to prophesy, but nobody would ever believe her. And it was awful, because she did prophesy truly, and people didn't believe what she said. And Lucy Easthope was saying, we should listen carefully to those who might appear to be saying something that we find it difficult to believe or to understand, because they might be right. Jesus found it difficult to listen to the Syrophoenician woman, but what she said proved to be of great importance. People found it difficult to listen to a man with a speech impediment, but when they were enabled to hear him, he had good news to share. So my second question to you today: as you come of age, are you a community of people who listen to others, even the unexpected ones, and enable them to be heard? So, Jesus cured the man of his deafness and his speech impediment, but in the process, he spat on his tongue. I actually find that repulsive, absolutely repulsive. And I'm guessing that many of you do as well. It really isn't something we would do, is it? In our culture, spitting is strongly discouraged. It spreads disease. It's a huge sign of disrespect. When I was teaching, a particularly troubled teenage boy once spat on the back of my hair as he left the classroom. I knew about it immediately because the rest of the group were horrified by it. They couldn't believe that he'd done it. And they weren't all angels, believe me, they were not all angels in that year 3 in a secondary school group. But they were horrified by what he'd done. No such horror is shown by those who saw Jesus spitting on this man's tongue. And we know why that was. It was because in the ancient world, traditional healing often involved the transfer of something from the body of one person to another, and spittle was one of the things that was thought to be very, very effective. And interestingly, we actually know that spittle has healing properties. Saliva improves the functioning of inflammatory cells, and that's needed in the healing of wounds. And it contains different proteins that are important for healing. Kissing something better is not necessarily a fruitless exercise in physical terms. Jesus used traditional healing methods. He was a person of his time, and he related in ways that they could understand. He didn't always use those methods, apparently, but on occasion he did. And as we come to know Jesus more fully, we know that we are called to share the good news of God's love with the others around us. Have a look, if you can, at this picture on the screen now. It comes from the Methodist Modern Art Collection. It's not one of the better-known ones, and it's called Christ Walking on the Water by the artist Peter Howson. The big figure is Peter, the Apostle Peter. The smaller one, the more hazy one in the background, there's Christ walking on the water. Look at the way that Peter is pointing. He isn't pointing towards Christ. His hand may be basically in the shape of a blessing, but he's pointing away from Jesus and looking away from Jesus to us, to others, because he's received the blessing and now he's wanting to share that with others. He's pointing away from himself, pointing away from Jesus. This is a mature Peter who's grown in his knowledge of Jesus and wants to share it. And we want to do this. We want to engage in mission. We want to be evangelists. But how do we do it appropriately and well? How do we relate to the culture in which we live? And you only have to look at the history of the Christian church to see that there are almost always conversations or arguments about how it's appropriate to relate to the culture of the time and to the questions and the technology of the time. Johannes Gutenberg is credited with inventing the printing press in the 15th century. It's a bit of an aside, but I've just bought a T-shirt that I really like, and it says on it, books, giving introverts the excuse not to engage in conversation since 1445, something like that, because that's when printing was produced. So actually, apparently, there were automated printing processes in China and Korea before that, but in our culture, it was Gutenberg. And once the printing press was invented, Bibles could be printed and circulated. And eventually, they were printed and circulated in the language of the people that they could understand. And some thought this was a very dangerous technology. It would damage the faithful. because they would no longer have to depend on people like me standing and talking to them. They could read it for themselves, and they might even start thinking for themselves. Much more recently, we've been asking questions about the opportunities offered through being able to worship online. What is or isn't acceptable? How do we maintain correct Christian teaching in a new context? How do we respond to people of different cultures? How do we respond to growing understanding of diversity, of sexuality and gender? How do we ensure the inclusion of the neurodivergent? And I'm sure you can think of other areas that challenge us as we work out how to respond and relate meaningfully to others. We're not going to do it by spitting on their tongues, but we do need to relate to the culture of our time. We're called to share our faith, and we need to keep learning how to do it. So my final question to you today, you'd expect 3, it is a sermon. As you come of age, are you a community of people who will continue to share your faith in ways that those around you will understand? So 3 questions for a church coming of age. Are you a community of people who listen to God? Are you a community of people who listen to others, even the unexpected ones, and enable them to be heard? And are you a community of people who will continue to share your faith in ways that those around you will understand? Questions for you on this anniversary, questions for all of us, wherever we are and whatever we're doing. And to God be the glory. Amen.